There is a crueler thing than being turned away at a rich man's door. It is being handed his money and invited to make a spectacle of yourself. So when the Duke of Colvane offered £300 to any lady who would coax his ruined gardens back to life, the whole county understood the true shape of the jest. The ladies would take the coins, spoil their slippers in the mud, and be laughed all the way home. That was the point of it. But one of them, a widow with nothing left in the world to lose, did the one thing no one had thought to guard against. She gave back every last penny but one. The notice reached Lynette Carew, as all bad news reached her now second-hand, and wrapped in a smile stretched too thin to be kind. She was standing at the sideboard in her sister-by-marriage's morning room, because standing was what she did in that house. Damaris Fenn took her tea by the window every day at 8:30, and every day Lynette poured it, and every day she was not asked to sit. The room smelled of hot chocolate and beeswax, and the particular staleness of a house where no window was ever opened for fear of the damp. Lynette was 29. Grief and economy had worn her down to the plain gray edges of herself, though her hands, when she set the pot down, were steady and brown and marked with 100 small scars that no lady's hands were meant to carry. "There," Damaris said, folding a printed bill and pushing it across the cloth with one gloved finger, as though it might soil her. "You have been moping beneath my roof for 2 winters, Lynette. Here is your remedy. His Grace at Marrowdean has lost his wits entirely, and means to pay £300 to any woman who will dig about in his dead flower beds. You were a gardener's wife. Go and dig." Behind her at the table, her 2 daughters pressed their napkins to their mouths and shook with silent laughter. Lynette picked up the bill and read it once, plainly as she read everything. The Duke of Colvane, it said, invited any gentlewoman of the district to undertake the restoration of the gardens of Marrowdean, and would settle upon her the sum of £300 for her trouble. There were no other conditions named at all. That absence of conditions was itself the joke, and everyone in the county understood it. A broken recluse, a garden he had left to rot out of grief, and a small fortune dangled before the ambitious mothers of the district like a bright lure before hungry trout. Whoever amused him longest, whoever flattered him best, might land a great deal more than £300. She might land a duke. Lynette was not a fool. She knew that the sort of lady who won such a game did not have scars on her hands. "I have no gown fit for calling on a duke," she said quietly. "No," Damaris agreed, pleased. "You have not. You will go looking exactly as you are, and his Grace will send you home again within the hour, and I shall at last be free to tell the whole parish that I did everything a Christian could for my poor brother's widow, and that she simply could not be helped." She sipped her tea. "Do try not to weep on the front steps. It travels so badly in the retelling." There it was, then, the whole of it laid bare. She was not being sent to succeed. She was being sent to fail in a manner colorful enough to finish her. A ruined widow turned away from the gates of Marrowdean would be a story worth dining upon for a season, and after that, no one would think to ask why Damaris Fenn no longer housed her brother's widow, or where the poor creature had gone. Then it waited for the old dread to rise in her throat. Instead, something else stirred, low and secret and very nearly like hunger, because she knew what grew at Marrowdean. She knew it the way only 2 people in all of England had ever known it, and one of them was 3 years in the ground. Somewhere in that rotting garden, if it lived at all, there stood a single white camellia that her husband had bred with his own 2 hands in the last good year of his life. He had named it and carried it to that house himself, and given it away long before the fever came, and took him, and took the nursery, and took every green and living thing the two of them had built together. She had not laid eyes on it since. She had believed she never would again. £300 meant nothing to her. She had already learned to live on very much less. But that camellia was another matter. That was worth walking to Marrowdean in the rain. Linnet folded the bill and slipped it into her sleeve. "Thank you," she said, with a calm that made Damaris glance up sharply from her cup. "I will go tomorrow." Marrowdean lay at the end of a valley that ran down to the sea, and Linnet smelled it long before she saw it. Salt and rot, and the green breath of too much rain. She had spent the last of her coach fare at a market town some 12 miles off, and walked the remainder, her boots soaking through on the sunken Cornish lanes, her one good shawl wound twice about her shoulders. She did not mind the walking. Walking cost nothing, and it gave her time to school, her face into something the world could not read. By the time the great iron gates rose out of the dripping hedges, gone orange with rust and hanging open upon their hinges, she had made herself perfectly calm. The house beyond was huge and dark and shuttered, a long, low manor of grey Cornish stone with a broken glass house rearing up behind it, like the bared ribs of some enormous animal left to weather on the shore. Yet it was not the house that stopped her breath. It was the garden. Even ruined, even drowned, beneath 3 years of neglect, she could read the bones of what it once had been. Terraces fell away toward the water in wide green steps, choked now with bramble and bindweed, their stone balustrades furred thick with moss. Yew hedges that had once stood clipped like walls had thrown out wild dark arms in every direction. A fountain sat dry and split, its basin brimming with black leaves. Somewhere beneath all that ruin lay a design of real and quiet genius, and a plantswoman's eye could trace it even through the wreckage, much as one might find the face of a beautiful young woman, still living in the aged face of her mother. Whoever had made this garden had loved it the way people love the living, and someone had let it die on purpose. "We are not receiving callers," the voice came from the gatehouse. An old man had stepped out of its low door, tall and spare and dressed in the sober black of an upper servant, though the black had gone green along its seams with age. His face was long and weathered and set in the deep lines of a man who had long ago given up expecting good news. He looked at her soaked hem, at her scarred hands, at the plain gray of her, and Linnet watched him decide, quietly and without malice, that she was no one at all. "You will have turned away 4 such ladies this month already, I should think," Linnet said. "Their carriages will have churned your drive to soup. I came to you on foot, so I have spared you that much at least." The old man's eyes lifted to her face. "His Grace does not see the ladies who come about the notice," he said. "He never once intended to. The notice was Lord Osric's doing, and not his own. If you have walked all this weary way in hope of £300 and a duke, you have wasted a very wet morning." So that was the true shape of it. The duke had not written the notice at all. Some other hand had baited this trap, and for some purpose of its own. Linnet set the name aside carefully in her mind, Osric, and let none of her thinking reach her face. "I have not come about the money," she said. "Why, and I have not come about the duke. I have come about the camellia." The old steward went very still. It was a small thing, that stillness. But Linnet had spent 10 years learning to read the small things men did not mean to show. His hand tightened on the gatepost. Something crossed his tired face that was not suspicion, but something far more painful to look upon, something like hope taken up and strangled in the same breath. "There is no camellia," he said. "There is a white camellia," Linnet answered steadily, "against the south wall of a walled garden that no living soul has been permitted to enter since the late Duchess died. It was planted in her last spring. It should be coming into bud within the month, if the frost has spared it, and if it has not already died of pure loneliness. I know all of this because the man who bred it and who carried it to this house in his own arms was my husband. His name was Tobias Caro. I have walked 12 miles today to learn whether the last thing he ever made in this world is still alive. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the rain falling into the dead fountain. Then the old steward turned without another word and started up the ruined drive toward the shuttered house, moving faster than a man of his years had any right to move, and leaving the gate standing open behind him. Linnet could not tell whether she had just talked her way inside or talked her way into being thrown out by someone a good deal larger than the gatekeeper. She drew her wet shawl tighter, stepped through the open gate, and followed him in. The old steward did not lead her to a drawing room. He led her instead along the flank of the great house, beneath the dripping eaves, past window after shuttered window, until they came to a low door set into a wall of wet, gray stone. Linnet had to hurry to keep his pace. He had not said a single word since the gate, and the tight set of his shoulders told her that whatever she had loosed in him with the name Tobias Caro, he did not yet trust himself to say it back to her. "Wait here," he told her at the door. "Do not wander off, and whatever his grace should say to you, do not weep. He cannot abide to be wept at." Then he was gone through the door, and Linnet stood alone in a mean little service yard with the rain coming down, and waited. She did not weep. She had done the whole of her weeping 3 years before, in a cold nursery house with the shutters drawn and the bailiffs waiting patiently out in the lane. She had none of it left to spend. She heard him before ever she saw him. A heavy, slow tread upon stone, the walk of a man who moved as though the very ground had personally wronged him. Then the door was hauled open from within, and the Duke of Colvane filled the whole of it. He was younger than she had braced herself for, and in far worse repair. He was tall, and built like a man who had once done hard things with his body, and had long since stopped doing anything at all. His dark hair was too long, and pushed back careless from a hard, unshaven face. His eyes were very dark, near to black, and they held the fixed, banked look of a hearth that has been let to burn down to ash on purpose. He wore no coat. His right hand, where it hung at his side, was a ruin of old white scarring, the fingers curled and held stiff, as though it had been crushed once, and had healed with a grudge against the world. He looked at her as the steward first had. Then he looked at her a good deal longer, and something behind his face shifted and went wary. "You are the woman who spoke my dead wife's garden to Cadwell as though you had some claim upon it," he said. His voice was low and rough, and held not the smallest grain of warmth. "You have upset an old man who has very few upsets left in him. I have half a mind to put you back on the road myself." "You should," Linnet agreed. "It would be the sensible thing. I am a stranger to you, and I am wet through, and I have arrived at your door with a story that sounds like the front end of a swindle." She met his black eyes and did not drop her own. "But you have not done it yet, Your Grace, and that tells me you want the answer to the very same question I do, whether it is still alive." The stillness that came over him then was a colder, deeper thing than the steward's had been. "There is nothing alive in that garden," he said. "You do not know that," Linnet said quietly, "because you have not been inside it, have you?" It was not a question, and they both heard that it was not. "The wall is sound. The door is locked. The ivy across the lintel has not been broken in 3 years. No one has gone in, and no one has come out. and so you cannot possibly know whether the thing that grows against the south wall is living or dead. You have only decided that it is dead because deciding it was easier than going to look. For a long moment, she thought he would strike her, or roar, or call the steward to throw her bodily into the lane. His jaw worked. The ruined hand curled tighter at his side. "My wife was called Iseult," he said at last, and the name came out of him like something torn loose. "She made that garden with her own hands over 11 years. In her last spring, when she was already too weak to kneel, a man brought her a white camellia he had bred and raised himself, and she wept over it like a child, and she had it planted against the warm south wall where she could see it from her window. She did not live to see it flower. I sealed the garden the week we buried her. I have not opened that door since." His dark gaze came up and fixed on Linnet, terrible and bare. "And now you stand in my yard, soaked to the bone, and tell me that the man who bred that camellia was your husband." "His name was Tobias Caro," Linnet said. "He named that camellia before he gave it away. I should like, very much, to know whether the name still has anything to hang upon." The Duke of Culvain stared at her. The rain ran off the broken gutters and filled the silence between them. Then he reached up with his good left hand to his own throat, and drew out from beneath his shirt a length of leather cord, and on the end of the cord hung a single heavy iron key, black with age, and worn bright in one place where a thumb had rubbed it a great many times. He had been wearing it against his chest for 3 years. Linnet understood that at once, as she understood soil and weather, and the small betraying signs of men. He had carried the key to the sealed garden next to his own heart every day and every night, and in 3 years he had not once been able to make himself use it, and he had not once been able to make himself take it off. He lifted the cord over his head. He crossed the yard to her, and he put the warm iron key down into her scarred and open hand, and closed her cold fingers around it with his ruined ones, and did not let go at once. "I cannot go in there," said the Duke of Culvain, in a voice that had stopped pretending to be hard. "Heaven help me, I have tried. You go. You look, and then you come back out here, and you tell me the truth, whatever the truth is." His throat moved. "Can you do that?" "Yes," said Linnet, "I can do that." The door in the wall did not want to open. 3 winters of Cornish damp had swollen the wood and seized the old lock, and Linnet had to set her shoulder to it and push while she turned the key with both hands. Then something gave all at once, and the door swung inward on a long groan of rust, and the breath of the sealed garden came out to meet her, cold and green and heavy with the smell of wet earth and rot, and underneath it all, faint and impossible. She stepped inside. Behind her, at the threshold, the Duke stopped as though he had walked into glass. He did not cross it. He stood in the doorway, with one hand braced on the frame, his face gone the color of tallow, and he looked at the ruin of his dead wife's garden, and could not make his feet move. Linnet left him there. This part she had to do alone anyway. The walled garden had been a small and perfect world once. She could see that much through the wreck of it. Someone had laid it out with real love, a knot of low box hedges gone shapeless and wild, gravel paths lost beneath 3 years of leaf fall, a stone bench green and slick in the corner. Everything that could die untended had died. The rose beds were black canes. The herb borders were a felt of dead nettle. It was a graveyard, and the rain fell on it, the way rain falls on graveyards. But the south wall faced the sea and held the day's warmth in its old stone, and Linnet turned toward it the way a needle turns north, because that was where Tobias would have put it, and that was where the Duke had said Iseult had it planted. And there, against the warm south wall, half strangled by bindweed and starved for light beneath a fallen trellis, was a camellia. It was alive. It was barely alive. It was leggy and yellowed, and desperate, most of its leaves shed, its bark peeling in the wrong places. But at the tip of one thin branch, held up toward what little light the sky allowed, was a single tight bud, green shading to the barest ivory white at its swollen tip, a bud that meant to open. Linnet went down on her knees in the wet gravel in front of it, without any thought at all for her one good gown. "There you are," she whispered. "There you are, my Marin. There you are." She had not spoken that name aloud in a very long time. It cost her more than she had expected, and she knelt there a moment with her scarred hand cupped beneath the living bud, not touching it, only sheltering it, while 3 years of held grief moved through her once, and passed on and left her steady again. This was the last thing Tobias had ever made. He had bred it in their own glasshouse across 7 patient years, and named it for the child they had buried between them, and then, when the fever and the debt came for everything, he had given it into the hands of the one great gardener in the West, who might keep it alive when they no longer could. He had been right to. It had lived. Against every reason in the world it had lived. Well, the Duke's voice came harsh from the doorway. He had not moved. He stood gripping the frame as though it were the only thing holding him upright, and he could not look at the garden, and he could not look away from Linnet. "Come and see for yourself," Linnet said. "I cannot. You can. You have simply decided that you cannot, the same as you decided. The whole of it was dead." She rose from her knees and turned to face him, and her voice, when it came out, was not unkind, but it did not spare him either. "Your Grace, there is one living thing left in this garden, and it is your wife's camellia, and it is trying, with everything it has to flower for a woman who is not here to see it. It has a bud on it. It will open inside the month, if it is fed and cut back and given light. Now, you may stand in that doorway and go on deciding that everything you loved is dead, or you may walk across this garden on your own 2 legs and look at the one thing that refused to die. But I have buried a husband and a child both, and I will tell you for nothing what I learned doing it. The dead do not need you to keep the door locked. That was never for them. That was always only for you. The rain fell. The sea sounded somewhere below the wall. The Duke of Colvane let go of the doorframe. He crossed the threshold of his dead wife's garden, for the first time in 3 years, walking heavily and unwillingly over the lost gravel paths, and he came to stand beside the widow at the south wall, and he looked down at the small, starved living thing with its one white bud, and his ruined right hand came up and pressed hard across his own mouth. And he made no sound at all. Linnet let him have it. She looked at the bud and gave him the dignity of her turned face, exactly the way she would have wished someone to turn theirs from her. When he could speak again, his voice had gone very low. "What does it need? Light, first. That trellis has to come off it, and the bindweed, and everything above it that steals its sun. Then feeding, and careful cutting, and a great deal of patience. It has been fighting alone for 3 years. It is tired." She paused. "It can be saved. But not in an afternoon, and not by a lady in silk slippers come to win £300 and a duke. It wants a real gardener, living on the place through the whole of the season." "Then you will do it," he said. It was not quite a question, and not quite a command. "I will restore your wife's camellia," Linnet said carefully, "and I will restore the whole of this garden around it, because a camellia does not thrive alone any more than a person does, and Iseult built this whole world to hold that one plant. Yes, I will do that. She turned the heavy iron key over once in her hand, and then held it out to him across the ruined bed. "But I will not take your £300 for it, Your Grace. And I think, before you decide whether to keep me, you had better hear why." He did not take the key back. "Go on. Your notice was not written by you. Cadwell told me at the gate. It was your cousin, Lord Osric." She watched his face and saw that the name landed hard. A man does not offer a fortune to every ambitious mother in the county, over the head of a duke known to be mad with grief, out of kindness to that duke. He does it to gather witnesses. He does it so that the whole district may watch a parade of foolish women come and go from Marrowdean, and go home shaking their heads, and say to one another how far the poor Duke of Colvane has fallen, how plainly he can no longer manage his own affairs. I have seen a version of this done before, on a smaller and crueler scale. To me, I know the shape of a man who means to have you declared unfit, Your Grace, and to hold everything you own in trust on your behalf. She let that settle. If you take on a penniless widow as your gardener, and let the county believe you have taken a mistress, you play directly into his hand. So before you say yes, you should know that keeping me may cost you a great deal more than £300. For a long moment, the Duke of Colvane said nothing. Then, slowly, something happened to his hard, grief-locked face that Linnet suspected had not happened in a very long while. One corner of his mouth pulled, and his dark eyes lost a fraction of their banked deadness, and he looked at her almost with appetite, the way a starving man looks at bread. "Let me be certain I have understood you," he said. "You have walked 12 miles in the rain, talked your way past my steward, refused my money, found the one living thing in my house, made me weep in front of a stranger, and diagnosed my cousin's entire conspiracy against me, and you have done the whole of it inside of 1 hour." "I am precise," Linnet said. "It is the only luxury poverty ever left me, Cadwell," the Duke said, without turning his head, and the old steward appeared in the garden doorway so promptly that he had plainly been listening to every word. "Mrs. Carrow will be staying at Marrowdean. Have the south room by the stair made up, the one that looks over the walled garden. Build the fire high. She has been cold long enough." He looked back at Linnet. "You will not be my mistress, and you will not be my joke, and you will most certainly not be my cousin's evidence. You will be my head gardener. It is a post that has stood empty 3 years, and I can think of no one on this earth better fit to fill it. £50 the quarter, a roof, your meals, and the freedom of that garden. Do we have an agreement?" "We do," said Linnet. And then, because honesty had always cost her less than the alternative, she added, "You should know that I would have done it for nothing. For the camellia alone, I want you to understand that I know the difference." "I do understand it," said the Duke of Colvane. "That is precisely why I mean to pay you." He rang for the steward again, and when Cadwell came, the Duke gave an order that plainly startled the old man more than anything else had that strange afternoon. "Bring food," he said, "a great deal of it, and hot. Bring it to the small parlor, not the dining hall. Mrs. Carrow has walked 12 miles and worked besides, and she has the look of a woman who has taught herself not to ask." Linnet opened her mouth to say that she required nothing, and then closed it again, because it would have been a lie, and because the Duke was watching her with the shrewd, tired knowing of a man who had once had to learn the same trick of refusing the things he most wanted. The food, when it came, was plain and enormous, cold fowl. A brown loaf still warm from the oven, a wedge of hard yellow cheese, stewed apples going soft in their own juice, a pot of tea strong enough to stand a spoon upright in. Linnet sat in a worn chair, by a fire that someone had built up without being asked, and she meant to eat only a little, and politely, as a guest eats in a house that is not hers. She did not manage it. Her body, which had been running for the better part of 2 days on a heel of bread and her own stubbornness, took the decision clean out of her hands, and she ate like the thing she had spent 3 years pretending she was not, which was hungry. The Duke did not watch her do it. He turned his chair to the fire, and sat with his ruined hand held open to the warmth, and his dark head tipped back against the leather, and his eyes closed, and he gave her the single kindness that costs a proud person nothing and means the most, which is the courtesy of not being looked at. Only when she set her cup down did he speak again, and even then he kept his gaze on the flames. "There is bread in this house every morning," he said, "and meat on most days. No one under this roof will ever again stand and watch you weigh whether you are permitted to eat it. That is not charity, Mrs. Carrow. That is only how a house is meant to run, and mine has not run like one in 3 years. You may consider its repair the first of your duties." Lynette woke the next morning in a warm room, and it frightened her. It took her a long moment to understand, the fear lying still under blankets that were thick and dry and smelled of cedar, watching a gray sea light move on an unfamiliar ceiling. There was no bell ringing for her. No one was calling her name down a cold corridor to lace a stay or carry a coal scuttle or account for a farthing. The only sounds were the sea below the walls and, somewhere nearer, the steady, companionable knock of an axe splitting wood. She had slept, for the first time in 3 years, in a place where no one wished her gone. Her body did not know what to do with the safety of it. It sat in her chest like a meal too rich to trust. Her cloak had been taken away wet the night before and returned to the chair while she slept, brushed clean of all the mud of the road and thoroughly dried before the kitchen fire. No one had said a word about it. She understood the message all the same. At Marrowdean, it seemed, you were not thanked and you were not flattered. You were simply, quietly, kept. She dressed in the same gray gown, the hem still faintly ghosted with old ink and new grass, and went down to find her garden. She met the dog first. He was waiting outside the walled garden door, an enormous aged lurcher, the color of dead bracken, gray about the muzzle and blind in one milky eye, and he rose stiffly as she came and put his great head against her hip with the frank presumption of an animal who has decided a matter without consulting anyone. "You must be Bracken," Lynette said, for the steward had warned her of him. The dog leaned his full considerable weight upon her and sighed the sigh of the truly content. From that morning he did not leave her side, which the whole household found remarkable, since Bracken had in his time bitten 2 footmen, 1 physician, and Lord Osric. The cook was a broad and silent Cornish woman named Mrs. Trewin, who had stayed on through all 3 years of the ruin out of a loyalty she would have died sooner than put a name to, and who had plainly decided well in advance to disapprove of the strange widow the Duke had installed in the south room. That resolve held firm until the morning she carried a tray out to the walled garden, meaning to set it down pointedly on the bench and leave, and found Lynette halfway up a ladder with her sleeves shoved past the elbow and her hands black to the wrist, easing a fallen climber back onto its wires and talking to it low under her breath, as though it could hear her and might take heart. Mrs. Trewin put the tray down without a single word. But the next morning there was an extra egg upon it, and the morning after that a twist of fried bacon, and inside the week the cook had taken to sending out a second breakfast at 11, with the grim announcement that a body could not mend a garden on air, and had no one ever once taught the woman to come in out of the wet. This, Lynette came slowly to understand, was how Marrowdean loved. Not in words, for it had lost the habit of words. It loved in eggs and in cloaks, dried by the kitchen fire, and in hearths built high without the asking, and in a half-blind old dog who would not leave your side. The whole broken household had been holding its breath for the better part of 3 years, and something in the plain sight of a woman on her knees in the dirt coaxing a dead place back toward living had let it begin, very cautiously, and without admitting to anything, to breathe once more. She worked. That first week she barely came indoors. She cut the fallen trellis off the camellia and hauled it away in pieces. She stripped the bindweed that had been strangling it by the armful. She cleared the beds above it so the poor light could reach its leaves, and she made a slow, careful compost of the years of leaf fall, and she began gently to feed the exhausted roots. The single bud swelled by a hair's breadth. She lived for the hair's breadth. The work was hard in a way that healed her. Her hands, which had gone soft and clumsy in Damaris Fenn's morning room, split and blistered and bled, and then hardened once more into the hands she recognized as her own. Her back ached from the good, honest place. Low down that means a day was spent on something real. She slept at night, without dreaming. And each evening, when she washed the earth from beneath her nails at the yard pump, the Duke of Colvane happened, with a transparency that neither of them ever once remarked upon, to be crossing that same yard at that same hour, so that he might ask after the camellia and be told in careful and unhopeful gardener's terms that it was not dead yet. It became the nearest thing either of them owned to a daily prayer, that plain exchange in the failing light. Is it living? It is living. Still, good then good. And because she was a real gardener and not a lady come to dabble, she read the garden as she worked. That was how she found the first of it. She had been clearing the long border beneath the east wall, expecting the ordinary wreckage of neglect, dead perennials and self-sown weeds. Instead, she found holes. Wide, deep, deliberate holes, a dozen of them, and more. Each one the size a mature shrub leaves behind when it is lifted whole and carried away. These were not plants that had died. These were plants that had been dug out, root ball and all, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and taken. Linnet knelt by the nearest hole and put her hand into it, and understood, with a cold and rising certainty, what she was looking at. She spent 2 more days making sure before she said a word. She walked the whole of the grounds beyond the walled garden, the terraces and the shrubberies and the ruined arboretum along the drive, and everywhere she found the same story written in the earth. The garden had not simply been left to die, it had been quietly and expertly robbed. Someone had been coming to Marrowdean through the 3 years of the Duke's grief, and lifting its rarest and most valuable living things, the mature magnolias, the tender exotics the Duchess had gathered from half the world, the very specimens a collector would pay a small fortune to own, and carrying them away 1 careful cartload at a time, and letting the ruin of everything else cover the theft. A neglected garden and a robbed garden looked identical to a grieving man who would not go outside. They did not look at all identical to a plantswoman on her knees in the beds. She found the Duke in the study he never used, and she laid it out for him plainly, the way she had learned to lay out hard truths, without softening and without heat. Your garden did not only die of neglect, Your Grace, she said. A great deal of it was stolen, the most valuable of it chosen by someone who knew precisely which plants were worth the trouble and the cart. This was not done by a passing thief, and it was done slowly over years by a man with keys and time, and every reason to be certain no one would ever walk these grounds and count what was missing. She met his darkening eyes. You told me your cousin wishes the county to believe you cannot manage your own affairs. I think Lord Osric has been doing a great deal more than talking. I think he has been selling your dead wife's garden out from under you, one rare tree at a time, and trusting your grief to keep the door shut behind him." The Duke of Colvane stood very slowly. For the first time since she had met him, the deadness was entirely gone from his dark eyes, and what stood in its place was not grief at all. It was fury, and it was terribly coldly awake. "Show me," he said. He walked the grounds with her the next morning, out of doors on his own 2 legs for the first time in 3 years. Linnet took him from hole to hole, and she did not spare him. She showed him where the great magnolia had stood that Isolde had raised from a seed sent by a missionary in the East. She showed him the empty terrace where a row of tender myrtles had wintered under glass. She named each missing thing by its right name, and she told him what a collector would have paid for it, and she watched the knowledge go into him like cold water into a man half asleep. When they came to the last of the plundered beds, he stood a long while looking down into the empty earth, and the ruined hand at his side opened and closed. Opened and closed. 3 years, he said at last, very quietly. For 3 years, I sat in a dark house and let him carry my wife's life away by the cartload, because I could not be troubled to open a door. He counted on my grief. He built his whole thieving on it. He turned to her, and his dark eyes had gone flat and dangerous. "I will have it all back, Mrs. Caro, every tree and every shilling, and a great deal besides. But I will do it properly, with proof no magistrate can wave away, and for that I must be patient a little longer. Can you write me a list? Every plant that is gone, what it was worth, where a man might sell such a thing in England." "I can," said Linnet. "I have already begun it." "Of course you have," said the ghost of a smile that crossed his hard face, and was gone. So they began to build the case quietly, in the evenings, she with her gardener's knowledge, and he with the name and the reach of a duke, writing letters to nurserymen and collectors, and the great houses of the South, asking after rare specimens lately come to market. It was slow work, and it was patient work, and neither of them spoke aloud the thing that was happening alongside it, which was that they had begun to spend their evenings together on purpose. The garden came on. The days lengthened by a cautious minute at a time. The single bud upon the camellia grew fat as a thumb, and showed, at its very tip, the first thin seam of white, like a letter not yet opened. Linnet caught herself happy, and did not know what to do with it, and kept the knowing of it to herself. The trouble, when it came the way trouble always came to her, up the drive, in a hired carriage, wearing a smile stretched too thin to be kind. She was on her knees at the south wall when Cadwell came to fetch her, and one look at the old man's face told her the whole of it before he opened his mouth. "There is a lady come," he said. "She will not give a name to me. She says she is your family, and that she has come to take you home, and that his grace may not prevent her." Linnet sat back on her heels. She looked at the little white seam upon the bud, and she felt the old cold dread try to rise in her, and she was surprised to find how little of it there was left. "She is not my family," Linnet said, getting to her feet and wiping the earth from her hands. "But I know who she is, and I had better see her, or she will make a scene fit to feed the gossips for a 12-month. Damaris Fenn stood in the great hall in a traveling pelisse of plum-colored velvet, turning slowly on her heel to take in the shabby grandeur of the place, doing sums behind her eyes. She had dressed for a duke. When she saw Linnet come in from the garden in her earth-stained gown, her scarred hands black to the wrist, her hair coming loose from its pins, something in her face curdled between triumph and disgust. "Look at you," Damaris breathed. "Oh, Linnet, it is worse even than they say." "You have made yourself a common laborer. You have made me the byword of the entire county." She pressed a gloved hand to her breast. "That I handed my own brother's widow to a recluse for the price of being rid of her. That I gave you away like an unwanted parcel. My name is in the mud, and it is you who put it there. And you will come home with me this instant, and let it be seen that you are respectable and under my roof, or I will not answer for what becomes of you." So, there it was. The joke had turned in her hand, exactly as such jokes did. She had sent Linnet to be humiliated, and instead Linnet had failed to be humiliated, and now the whole clever cruelty of it had swung round and bitten the hand that threw it. "You are not welcome to take anything from this house," said a voice from the stair. The Duke of Colvane came down slowly, and he had dressed, too, Linnet saw, in a dark coat that fit him, his overlong hair pushed back, and though he came down without hurry, there was nothing broken in him now. He looked precisely like what he was, which was one of the oldest and most dangerous names in England, and Damaris Fenn dropped into a curtsy so deep and so sudden that she nearly overbalanced. "Your Grace," she gasped. "I did not. That is, I had no notion you would trouble yourself. I came only for my poor dear sister, who is plainly not herself." "Mrs. Carrow is entirely herself," the Duke said. He came to stand beside Linnet, not touching her, a half-step nearer than propriety allowed, so that his meaning could not be missed. "She is the head gardener of Marrowdean, the finest in England to my certain knowledge, and she is here by her own free choosing and at a wage, and she is under my protection. You will not speak of selling women in my hall. You will not speak of madmen in my hall, and you will most certainly not speak of taking her anywhere at all." He let the silence stretch until Damaris was white with it. "You called her your poor dear sister just now. In 3 years of her widowhood, madam, did you ever once call her that to her face, or only now, when there is a duke in the room, to hear you do it?" Damaris opened her mouth and shut it again. Linnet stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was very clear and very steady, and it carried to every corner of the cold hole. "Go home, Damaris," she said. "Tell the county whatever you please. Tell them I dig in the dirt. It is true. Tell them I take a wage from a duke. That is true also. And when they ask you why your brother's widow would rather break her back in a stranger's garden than sit another hour in your morning room, you may tell them the truth of that as well, if you have the stomach for it." She drew a breath. "I am not coming back. I was never yours to send, and I am not yours to fetch. Whatever you built your comfort upon these 3 years, you will have to go on building it without me under your feet to stand upon." For a moment, Damaris Fenn looked at her as though she had never seen her before in her life. Then her face closed like a fan, and she gathered her plum-colored skirts, and she swept out to her hired carriage without another word, and the great door boomed shut behind her. The hall was very quiet. Linnet found that her hands were shaking and pressed them flat against her skirts to still them, as she always had. "You are trembling," the Duke observed. "I have just cut the last rope that held me to the only family I had," Linnet said. "Bad family is still family. It is a strange thing to be entirely alone in the world at 29. I expect I shall be glad of it by supper." The Duke of Colvane looked down at her for a long moment. "You are not alone in the world," he said gruffly. And then, as though the admission had cost him more than he cared to show, he turned and stalked off toward his study, calling back over his shoulder that the camellia would not weed itself and she was paid to work, not to stand about being tragic in his hall. Linnet went back to her garden, but she was smiling, and she could not seem to stop, and Bracken walked close against her side the whole long way. The cold came down out of the north in the second week, a hard, wet Cornish cold that got into the old stones of Marrowdean and would not be driven out. Linnet noticed the change in him before he said a word of it, because she had spent a year watching a man she loved try to hide his pain from her, and she knew every disguise a proud body wears. The Duke came later to the study each morning. He held his ruined right hand tucked against his chest, out of sight, as a man carries a wounded bird. When he thought himself unobserved, the hard lines around his mouth drew tight and white. By the third such morning he had stopped using the hand at all, and was signing his careful letters to the nurserymen in a cramped and clumsy left hand that shamed him, and the shame was worse to him than the pain. She said nothing for 2 days. She had learned that pride poked too soon only digs itself deeper. But on the third day she came into the study to find him standing at the cold window with his back to the room and his shoulders rigid, and on the desk behind him a pen lay in a spreading pool of spilled ink where his hand had failed him, and she understood that the waiting was over. "Your Grace," she said. "Leave it," he said without turning. His voice was ground down to gravel. "Leave me. Come back in an hour." "No," said Linnet. She went instead to the fire and set the kettle on its hook to warm, and then she went out, ignoring him entirely, and came back a quarter-hour later with a small covered pot from the still room and a strip of clean flannel over her arm. She drew the second chair close to the fire, the one she had never once seen him use, and she sat down in her own, and she said, in the plain, flat voice she used for stubborn soil and stubborn men alike, "Sit down and give me your hand." He turned then. His face was terrible, gray with pain and darker still with the fury of being seen. "I do not want your pity, madam." "Good," said Linnet, "for I have none to give you. Pity is a useless thing. It has never once mended a broken stem or a broken anything else. What I have is a pot of warmed oil and beeswax and comfrey out of your own garden, and a pair of hands that know how to use it, and an hour of daylight I would rather not waste watching a grown man ruin good letters because he is too proud to be helped. Now sit." For a long moment she thought he would refuse. Then slowly, like a man laying down a weight he has carried too far, the Duke of Culvain crossed the room and lowered himself into the chair beside hers, and with enormous reluctance laid his ruined right-hand palm up across her knee. She had seen worse hands, but not many. The old breaks had knit crooked. The scars from the glass ran white and deep across the palm and up into the wrist. The cold had drawn the whole of it into a stiff and useless claw. Linnet warmed the salve between her own palms first, so it would not shock him, and then she began, very gently, to work it into the ruined flesh, easing each locked joint through its small, painful arc, coaxing the seized muscles the way she would coax a root-bound plant to loosen and take hold. She did not look at his face while she did it. She gave him that. For a long while the only sounds were the fire and the sea and his breathing, which slowly by degrees grew less ragged. "It was the glass house," he said at last. He had not meant to speak. She could hear that he had not meant to. The winter. She was dying. There was a great gale off the sea, the worst in 40 years, and it took the old glass house where she kept her tenderest things, the ones she had carried home from the ends of the earth. I could not save her. Wand. The physicians had already told me I could not save her. So I went out into the storm to save her plants instead, because it was the only thing left in the whole world that I could do for her. And a bar came down, iron and glass. together across my hand. His voice was very low. It was all for nothing. The plants died in the frost that same night, and she died in the spring. Wah! I saved not one living thing that I set out to save, and I have this hand to remember it by, and I have hated the sight of the garden ever since, because the garden is only a great green record of everything I failed to keep alive. Linnet's hands went still upon his for a moment. Then they went on with their careful work. "My husband died in the spring as well," she said quietly. "Of a fever we could not break. I sat with him 9 nights. On the last of them he was past knowing me. And he talked, as the dying do, and all his talking was of the camellia. Not of me, not of the child we had lost, of the plant, whether it had water, whether the frost would come. I was so angry, Your Grace. I sat holding the hand of a dying man, and I was so angry that at the very end it was a shrub he thought of, and not his wife." She drew a slow breath. "It took me the better part of 3 years to understand that he was not choosing the plant over me. He was doing the only thing he had strength left to do. He was leaving me, the one thing he had that might outlast him. He was trying to save a living thing for me to have, because he could not save himself, to stay. It was the most loving thing he ever did, and I did not understand it until this very garden, and I will owe you for that understanding until the day I die." The Duke of Colvane turned his head and looked at her. She felt him look, and she made herself go on rubbing the warmth into his broken hand, because if she stopped, if she met his eyes, something would happen that neither of them was ready to answer for. "Linnet," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It came out of him rough and careful, as though he were handling something that might break. "Your hand will be easier by morning," she said, not looking up. "You must keep it warm and out of the wet. I will make more of the salve. It is only comfrey and beeswax and patience. It cannot mend what was broken, but it can stop the cold from breaking it again and again, if someone tends to it before the seizing sets in." Her voice was not quite steady. "It only wants someone to notice before it goes too far. Most things do." The Duke lifted his good left hand slowly, and with the backs of 2 fingers he tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, the way a man does a thing he has wanted to do for a long time, and has finally stopped being able to prevent himself from doing. "You have earth on your face," he said softly. "You always have earth on your face. I find that I have come to look for it." Linnet did meet his eyes then. She could not help it. And whatever the arrangement between them had been, the tidy fiction of Duke and gardener, of wage and work, of 2 griefs sharing a garden by chance, it did not survive that look. It cracked straight across cleanly, all the way through, and underneath it was the real thing they had been quietly and desperately growing all along, and there was no locking that door again. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the cold went on, but his hand had gone warm and easy in hers, and neither of them let go, and the fire burned down, and it was a very long time before either of them remembered that there was any such thing in the world as a letter to be written. They did not speak of it, and they did not need to. The days after took on a shape that neither of them would have dared ask for aloud. The Duke came out into the garden now in the mornings, and did what work his hand allowed, which was more each day, and when it failed him, he held the stakes while she tied them, and did not seem to feel the smallness of the task. His face had lost its tallow color. The hard lines came only when the cold did, and she had the salve for that. He laughed once at something Bracken did, a startled, rusty sound that he seemed as surprised by as she was, and she thought it might be the first time that Garden had heard a man laugh in a very long while. The bud upon the camellia opened its white seam a little wider every day. Linnet measured it against her thumb each evening. Soon, she told it, soon. You have waited long enough. And so, she was beginning to let herself believe, had she. She should have known better than to be happy where anyone could see. For while the two of them tended a dying garden back toward life, and said nothing aloud of what was growing between them, Lord Osric was in London, and Lord Osric had heard that a widow was digging up the truth at Marrowdean, and Lord Osric had decided that it was time at last to come home to the country. The knock upon the great door, when it came, was not the knock of family, nor of a tenant, nor of any soul with honest business. It was the confident triple rap of a man who has brought the law with him and means to use it. Lord Osric did not come alone. He came into the hall of Marrowdean as though he already owned it, a smooth and handsome man of 40 in a coat cut too fine for the country, drawing off his gloves, finger by finger, and looking about him with the proprietary sorrow of a man surveying property he expects shortly to improve. Behind him came two others. One was a dry stick of a physician with a leather bag. The other was a lawyer with a document case, and the carefully blank face of a man being paid not to have opinions. "Cousin," said Lord Osric when the Duke came down. His voice was warm and terrible. "Emeric, oh, my poor fellow! I came the moment I heard. The whole county is speaking of it, and I could not in conscience stay away." His sorrowful gaze slid to Linnet, standing in the doorway to the garden in her working clothes, and sharpened and dismissed her. "And this, I collect, is the creature, the, gardener." He made the word obscene. "Emeric, we must talk, you and I, as family. It grieves me more than I can say, but a man who pays every spinster in the county to dig in his flower beds, who seals himself in a dark house for 3 years, who now installs a penniless widow as his mistress under a laborer's title, and lets her turn the county into a bear garden of gossip, such a man, cousin, is not well. He is not himself, and those of us who love him must be brave enough to act for his own protection." He turned to the lawyer. "I have here a petition. It wants only a physician's word and a magistrate's seal, and I have brought the one and consent for the other by nightfall. It is the kindest thing, Emeric. You will be cared for. I will manage the burden of the estate, so that you need never trouble your poor grieving mind with it again." There it was, laid bare in the cold hall, the whole of the 3 years' patient cruelty come to collect. Linnet looked at the Duke of Colthane, and was afraid for one moment that the old deadness would come down over him again, that he would fold under the weight of the word mad, as a grieving man folds. But the Duke was not looking at his cousin at all. He was looking at her, and there was the faintest lift at the corner of his hard mouth, and he gave her a small nod, as a man gives a signal that has been agreed upon in advance. Because they had agreed upon it in advance, they had spent 3 weeks agreeing upon it. Letter by patient letter, in the evenings by the fire. "Osric," said the Duke pleasantly, "before your physician troubles himself, I wonder if you would satisfy my curiosity on a small matter, a matter of gardening. You will indulge a madman his whims." He turned. "Mrs. Carrow, would you be so good as to bring in the ledger you have kept for me?" Linnet brought it. It was not a ledger of money. Posh! It was a ledger of plants in her own precise hand, and she laid it open upon the hall table, and she began in the flat, clear voice of an expert who cannot be hurried to read. "A magnolia campbellii, some 30 years grown, lifted from the west terrace of this estate 2 winters past," she read. sold in the spring following to a collector in Surrey through an agent in Exeter, for 200 guineas. I have the collector's letter, in which he names the man who sold it to him, a row of 7 tender myrtles, lifted from the glasshouse border, a pair of tree ferns brought from the far side of the world by the late Duchess herself, a camellia grove, a bed of Turk's cap lilies, item upon item upon item, your grace, each one lifted whole and living from these grounds by a man with a key and a cart, and each one sold on, and each one traced, by name of buyer and name of seller and sum of money, to the same hand. She looked up, and she looked directly at Lord Osric, and she did not blink. Yours. The color went out of Lord Osric's handsome face all at once. This is absurd, he said. A gardener's spite. Who will take the word of a duke's kept woman over a peer of the realm? No one, perhaps, said the Duke of Colvane. And now he did move, coming down the last of the stairs unhurried, and there was nothing bowed or beaten in him at all. Which is why I did not trouble to rest it upon her word. He drew from his coat a thick fold of papers, and let them drop upon the table beside the ledger. Letters, cousin, from the collector in Surrey, and the agent in Exeter, and 2 great houses in Kent, and a nurseryman in Chelsea, every one of whom was delighted to correspond with the Duke, inquiring after rare specimens lately come to market, and every one of whom named you freely. You were not stealing from a madman, Osric. That was your whole mistake. You were stealing from a man who was merely asleep, and I have woken up. He let the silence do its work. You came here today to have me declared unfit, so that no one would ever look too closely at the accounts of an estate you had already been quietly robbing for 3 years. It was well done. It was very nearly done. But you were 3 weeks too late, and you have brought a lawyer into my hall at the very moment I have the proof to see you transported for theft. So, shall we send for that magistrate after all? You did offer. Lord Osric looked at the letters, he looked at the ledger, he looked at the 2 men he had brought with him, and both of them had taken a careful step back from him, the physician clutching his bag and the lawyer already closing his case. What do you want? Osric said. His voice had gone to a whisper. I want every shilling those sales fetched. Returned to this estate, the Duke said. I want it in writing. Witnessed today by the very lawyer you were kind enough to bring. And then I want you gone from Cornwall, and gone from England, and I want never to hear your name again, in connection with anything I love. Do that, and I will not send for the magistrate. Refuse me, and you will spend what remains of your life in a place a great deal less comfortable than the estate you meant to steal. He leaned down, close to his cousin's gray face. You counted on my grief for 3 years, Osric. You should not have. Grief ends, and the woman who ended mine has just counted every tree you took, by name. It was done inside the hour. The lawyer, glad to be on the winning side of it, drew up the papers with great efficiency. Lord Osric signed everything put before him with a shaking hand, and did not once look at Linnet, and, when it was finished, he went out to his carriage, a smaller man than he had come in, and the wheels ground away down the long drive, and were gone. The hall was very quiet. Linnet closed the plant ledger. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She had spent 10 years being made small by cruel and clever people, and she had just watched one of them undone entirely. Not by cruelty and not by cleverness, but by patience, and by knowing exactly how many myrtles ought to have stood along a glass-house wall. You knew, she said when he walked in. You already knew you had him. We had him, the Duke corrected. I could name the thief. Only you could count the theft. He looked at her across the quiet hall, and the look was not steady at all. I have been asleep for 3 years, Linnet. You did not wake me gently. You walked into my yard in the rain and told me my grief was a locked door I had made for my own comfort. And you were right, and I have not had a peaceful moment since, and I would not trade one of them to have the peace back." He stopped, as though he had said more than he meant to. "There is a thing I must say to you, but not here, in this cold hall with my cousin's stink still in it. Come out to the garden, come and see. The bud has opened." "It opened this morning while he was making his speech. I saw it over your shoulder. The camellia had bloomed in the night." Linnet stopped just inside the garden door and put her hand to her mouth. There against the warm south wall, on the poor leggy exhausted plant she had fed and cut and coaxed and half prayed over for a season, was a single open flower. It was the pure, clean white of new milk, wide as a saucer, its petals folded in on themselves in the old formal way, and it held its face up to the thin Cornish sun as though 3 years of dark and neglect had been nothing at all, as though it had only been waiting all this while for someone to come back. The last thing her husband ever made, the name of the child they had buried, alive and open, and white in the sun. She did not weep, but it was a near thing, and she was not ashamed of how near. "Tobias would have wept," she said when she could. "He never could keep his face straight over a first flower. He said a man who could watch a thing bloom without weeping had no business growing it." She laughed, and the laugh was wet. "I used to tease him for it. I would give a great deal to tease him for it now." The Duke stood beside her, looking not at the flower, but at her. "I have something of yours," he said. He held out his good left hand, and upon the palm of it lay a small heavy purse of soft leather. She knew what it was before he told her. She had seen it in the study drawer. £300, he said. The sum named in the notice, to any lady who should restore the gardens of Marrowdean. You have restored them, Linnet. You have done the thing the notice asked, and done it as no one on this earth could have done it, and whatever else lies between us. That debt is honest and it is owed, and I will not have it said that the Duke of Colvane offered a fortune and then cheated the one woman who earned it. It is yours. Take it." Linnet looked at the purse for a long moment. Then she took it, and she loosened its string, and she poured the whole of it out into her cupped hand, the bright gold and the heavy silver. £300, more money than she had held in the whole of her adult life, enough to keep her in modest comfort for years, enough to make her free of any man's roof forever. She looked at it lying in her scarred palm, and then she poured it back into the purse, all of it, every coin, and drew the string tight, and held it out to him again. "No," she said, "Linnet. Not one gold piece of it, not one silver." Her voice was shaking now, and she let it shake. "Do you not see what taking it would make me? It would make me the last of them, the last lady up the drive with her hand out. It would make me a woman who came to Marrowdean for £300 and a duke, and got them, and I could not bear it, because it is not true, and I have spent my whole life being made into things that are not true by people who found the truth of me inconvenient. I did not do this for your money. I have told you so from the first hour. I did it for the camellia. I did it for a dead man and a dead child, and a stranger's grief that I could not walk past. If you pay me for that, you make it a transaction, and it was never a transaction, and I will not let it become one now, at the very end, when it is the only clean thing I have ever done." She pressed the purse hard into his ruined hand, and folded his crooked fingers over it, the way he had once folded hers over a key. "Take back your £300, your Grace. I return every penny of it." He stood holding the purse she had refused, and something was working in his face that she had never seen there, a kind of wonder, painful and total. "Every penny," he said slowly. "You return every penny." And then she reached into the pocket of her earth-stained apron, and she drew out one small coin, a single copper penny, worn smooth, and she held it up between them so that he could see it. "Every penny but this one. This one I am keeping. And I mean to earn the keeping of it honestly, so that no one may ever say I took a thing I did not pay for." She drew a breath. "There is a cutting. I took it from the camellia 3 weeks ago, when I first cut it back, a good strong shoot, and I have rooted it in a pot in the still room, and it has taken. It is the only thing in this whole garden that I want for my own. The last living piece of the last thing my husband ever made, that carries my daughter's name. I will not ask you to give it to me, because I have been given too many things by too many people who wanted me grateful. So I am buying it from you, 1 penny, for 1 cutting. And then it is mine, bought and paid, and it belongs to no one's charity, and neither your grace do I." For a long moment, the Duke of Colvane could not speak at all. Then he set the purse of £300 down upon the stone bench, carelessly, as though it were nothing, as though it were leaves, and he took her face in both his hands, the whole one and the ruined one together, and he looked at her as though he were the one who had waited a season in the dark for a reason to open. "Keep your penny," he said, his voice breaking. "Keep your cutting. Keep the whole garden, keep the house, keep every acre and every shilling, and every year I have left, I do not care. Take all of it or none of it, as you please. Only do not offer me 1 penny of your leaving. That is the one coin I cannot bear." He pressed his brow to hers. "I have watched every other soul in my life be carried off, by fever and by war and by the plain cruelty of the world, and I sealed myself in the dark so that it could never happen to me again, and it did not work, because you walked in anyway, out of the rain, and made me love you before I had the sense to lock the door. I am asking you to stay, Lynette, not as my gardener, not for a wage, not for £300, nor for 300,000. Stay because a garden wants 2 people to tend it, and a house wants a reason to keep its fires lit, and because I would rather quarrel with you over the price of kennels and hothouses for the next 40 years than be at peace with anyone else on this earth. Marry me. Buy your cutting for your penny, and then for pity's sake, marry me, and let us grow the rest of it together." Lynette Caro, who had taught herself never to hope for anything she could not earn with her own 2 hands, looked up into the face of the man who was asking, and found that her voice, when at last it came, was perfectly steady. "I will pay my penny," she said, "and I will keep my cutting, and, yes, I will stay. I will marry you, and I will audit your accounts, and I will keep the hounds off the seedlings, and I will very likely make you weep over a great many first flowers before we are through." She smiled, and it was a smile with no shadow anywhere in it at all. "But I am keeping the penny. Emeric, on that one point I will not be moved." They were married that spring, in the small grey church at the foot of the Marrodine Valley, with the sea sounding beyond the churchyard wall. There were no great London names among the guests, and neither of them missed them. Cadwell gave the bride away, standing very straight in his green-black coat, and weeping, without the smallest shame, the whole way up the aisle. Mrs. Trewin sat in the front pew in a bonnet. She had trimmed herself, and glared at anyone who looked as though they might not take the occasion seriously. Bracken lay across the chancel step in a patch of colored light from the one good window and sighed through the whole of the service. Lynette did not wear white. She wore a gown of deep garden green, and pinned at her breast, in place of any jewel, was a single white camellia, cut that morning from the plant against the south wall, the second flower it had ever given, and she carried in her glove one small worn copper penny that she had refused, gently and finally, to leave at home. The news reached the county within the week, and it was not a scandal. It was a marvel. The gossips did not know how to hold it. The mad duke was not mad. The kept woman was a duchess. The garden that everyone had left for dead was said to be the wonder of the West once more, and the widow who had been sent up the drive as a joke to be laughed home in the mud had somehow walked out of the whole cruel jest wearing one of the oldest coronets in England. Lord Osric was not there to see it. He had gone abroad quite suddenly, and did not return, and the money from every stolen tree came home to Marrowdean, to the last farthing, and was spent at the new duchess's firm direction, on glass. For the great ruined glass house was rebuilt that summer, the bared iron ribs of it glazed clean and new against the sky, and filled once more with tender growing things, so that the record of everything the Duke had failed to save became, instead, the place where his wife grew everything they meant to keep. Damaris Fenn wrote, of course, once the coronet was certain. It was a long letter, and a warm one, full of dear sister and fond remembrance, and the smallest possible mention of an old misunderstanding best forgotten between family. The new Duchess of Colvane read it once, standing in her own glass-house with earth to her elbows, and then she used it to line the bottom of a seed tray, which was, her husband observed, the most useful that particular correspondence had ever been. A year on, the garden was itself again. The terraces fell green and glorious to the sea, the fountain ran, and in the walled garden, against the warm south wall, the white camellia stood strong and full and unafraid. No longer the last living thing in a graveyard, but the oldest and most honored resident of a place gone riotously back to life. There was a new bed beside it now, small and carefully kept. In it grew a single young camellia, raised from a cutting just beginning to find its strength. It was called Merrin, as the great plant against the wall was called Merrin, for Linnet would not have dreamed of calling it anything else. The name a grieving young father had once given to a white flower for a daughter he had lost had outlived them both and gone on quietly growing, and that, in the end, was the only monument any of them had ever needed. It had cost, the Duchess liked to say, exactly 1 penny, which made it the only thing in all of Marrowdean that was entirely and unarguably her own. The penny itself lived in a little dish upon her writing desk, where she could see it. She never explained it to callers, and her husband never explained it either, and the two of them shared, over the worn copper of it, a private joke that no one else in the world was ever permitted to understand. On a warm evening at the end of that first summer, the Duke of Colvane came out into the garden to find his wife on her knees, in the new small bed, doing what she was always doing, coaxing a young thing toward the light. He lowered himself down beside her, his mended hand easy in the warmth of the day, and for a while neither of them said anything, because they had long since stopped needing to fill their silences. "You have earth on your face," he said at last. "I always have earth on my face," said the Duchess. "You told me once you had come to look for it." "So I did." He was quiet a moment. "I have been thinking of the notice." Osric's wretched notice. £300 to any lady who would dig in my dead garden. He meant it as the cruelest joke he could devise, you know. He meant to fill my grounds with fools and my name with gossip, and my head with the certainty that I was finished. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the old gesture worn smooth now, with use like her penny. It was a cruel joke, the cruelest anyone ever played on me. Linnet leaned into his side, and looked at the small camellia that had cost her 1 penny, and at the great one blooming against the wall that had cost her everything, and given it all back, and at the man beside her who had handed a soaked stranger the key from around his own neck and never once asked for it back. It was a cruel joke, she agreed, but I find on the whole that I am terribly fond of how it ended. Did the moment Linnet returned every penny but one give you chills the way it gave them to me? There is nothing on this earth quite so satisfying as watching a quiet, weary, underestimated woman walk into a house that meant to break her, and instead bring the whole dead place roaring back to life, and win the heart of the wounded man inside it, without ever once bending who she is. If you love a heroine with dirt on her hands and steel in her spine, and a scarred, guarded hero who is undone by the one woman who refuses to pity him, then you are exactly the sort of soul this channel was made for. Take a moment now to tap that like button, for it truly does help more than you know. Share this story with someone who believes, as we do, that the gentlest people are so, very often, the strongest. And do subscribe and ring the bell, so that you never miss the next of our slow, warm, deeply felt historical romances. Tell me down in the comments below, what was your favorite moment, and what should the Duchess plant next?